They called it the Iron Curtain, but it didn't stop at barbed wire and watchtowers in the forests of Europe. It wrapped itself around oceans, harbors, and coastlines too. For Soviet citizens serving abroad, sailors, technicians, military advisors, the border wasn't a line on the ground. It was the deck of a ship, the gate of a port, the perimeter of a foreign base watched by KGB officers and political minders. Most people today know the classic Cold War escape stories: East Germans tunneling under the Berlin Wall, Hungarians sprinting across fields toward Austria, Czechs hiking through dark forests to reach the West. But there was another theater of escape that is far less remembered: the blue-gray waters of the Mediterranean and the sun-baked shores of North Africa. In that world, Tunisia sat in a quiet corner of the map, close to Libya, close to Italy, close to the smuggling routes that had crisscrossed the central Mediterranean since World War II. It was not a Soviet base. It was not a NATO stronghold. It was something more dangerous for Moscow and more promising for anyone dreaming of freedom. A space in between. A place where, if you were desperate enough and lucky enough, you might slip out of the Soviet sphere and into the open sea of the West. This is the story of what we might call the Tunis escape route. Not a formal program filed in secret archives, but a pattern, a set of opportunities that opened up whenever Soviet power brushed against the open edges of the Mediterranean world. It is built from real pieces: the way the Soviet Union controlled emigration, the way its navy and advisors operated from Arab ports, the way smugglers used the North African coastline, and the way defectors from the Eastern Bloc turned third countries into their doors to freedom. For American viewers, it is also a window into something else: how a handful of men and women who slipped away from Soviet control came face to face with a very different world. U.S. warships bristling with advanced radar, NATO ports humming with modern logistics, European cities lit by the glow of consumer technology. In that contrast, you can see why Soviet leaders feared not just American missiles, but American microchips, photocopiers, and television sets. In the Soviet Union, leaving your country without permission was not just frowned upon, it was a crime. The regime built an entire system to keep its people in place. Internal passports controlled where you could live and work. Foreign travel required layers of approvals from party committees and security services. The lucky few who did go abroad, sailors, diplomats, military advisors, engineers, were carefully selected, closely watched, and expected to come home. Desertion was punished harshly. Those who tried and failed faced long prison terms or labor camp sentences. Their families back home could lose jobs, housing, and access to education. Even the word defector carried a special sting in Soviet propaganda, used as a label of ultimate betrayal. Lists of known Soviet and Eastern Bloc defectors read like a who's who of people the system had trusted: pilots, KGB officers, ship captains, diplomats, engineers, exactly the kind of men the state relied on to project its power abroad. So when we talk about someone trying to flee through a place like Tunis, we are talking about a person who had already beaten the odds to get outside the Soviet Union legally, assigned to a ship, a base, a project in the Arab world, and who then decided to take a step that could cost not only his life, but the safety of everyone he left behind. To understand why North Africa appears in this story, you have to look at how the Soviets moved into the Mediterranean in the first place. In the 1950s and 1960s, Moscow began arming and advising a string of Arab states: Egypt under Nasser, Syria, Iraq, and later Algeria and Libya. The idea was simple: fill the vacuum left by retreating European powers, counter American influence, and flank NATO from the south. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Mediterranean Squadron, sometimes called the Fifth Escadra, had become a permanent fixture at sea. A declassified CIA report describes how Soviet diesel submarines and surface ships patrolled the Mediterranean for months at a time, resupplied by tankers and supported from Arab ports. The Soviets had an oil storage facility in Port Said, a repair ship permanently stationed in Alexandria, and effective control over parts of an Egyptian Yet shipyard. Soviet bombers and patrol aircraft flew from Egyptian bases to provide reconnaissance and anti-submarine coverage for the squadron. In Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi took power in 1969, Soviet advisors and technicians arrived to deliver weapons, train Libyan forces, and support radical movements across the region. A detailed CIA paper from that era estimates that by the late 1970s, there were around 1,500 Soviet economic and military advisors stationed in Libya alone, and that Moscow had gained access to Libyan port facilities for Soviet ships. Similar patterns appeared in Algeria, Syria, and elsewhere. Soviet personnel, Soviet ships, Soviet hardware, all operating far from home, but still under the eye of Soviet intelligence. From the Soviet perspective, this was a success story. Their flags flew in ports from Alexandria to Tripoli and westward toward Tunis. Their ships shadowed the U.S. Sixth Fleet in waters that Western strategists once called a NATO lake. Their advisors helped train Arab pilots, man radar stations, and supervise the use of missile systems against Western-made aircraft. For a superpower that had started the Cold War mostly bottled up behind its own frontiers, this felt like breaking out. But there was a problem built into that success. Every Soviet sailor on a destroyer in Alexandria, every radar technician on a Libyan airbase, every military advisor in a port city had something his compatriots back home did not: physical proximity to the outside world. They saw Western ships at anchor across the harbor. They heard foreign radio broadcasts more clearly than the jamming equipment could block. They watched European tourists step off cruise liners, move freely through streets and markets, then disappear again on ferries and flights bound for Rome, Marseille, or Athens. The KGB understood the danger. That is why Soviet crews abroad lived under a web of surveillance. Political officers monitored morale, shore leave was restricted or supervised, contact with locals was carefully controlled. But no security system is perfect. Every deployment created a new set of cracks, and some of the people who slipped through those cracks tried to turn the Mediterranean into their escape route. We have detailed accounts of how that worked in some places. In the famous Kudirka incident of 1970, a Lithuanian sailor serving on a Soviet vessel in the North Atlantic swam to a U.S. Coast Guard cutter seeking asylum, only to be handed back to the Soviets and sentenced to prison. Other defectors tried their luck in Black Sea ports, slipping into foreign ships or Western consulates. A mutiny on the Soviet frigate Storozhevoy in 1975 nearly succeeded in taking the ship to Sweden before it was recaptured and its leader executed. North Africa doesn't appear in those famous cases, but the logic is the same. Wherever Soviet ships docked or Soviet advisors were based, the possibility of escape existed, however slim. And in the arc of ports stretching from Alexandria to Tripoli and westward toward Tunis, those possibilities multiplied. Tunisia itself was not a Soviet client state. After independence from France, it pursued a more moderate, Western-leaning path than some of its neighbors. But its geography made it part of the story, whether Moscow liked it or not. Just across the water from Sicily and not far from the sea lanes Soviet ships used to move between the Black Sea and their Arab partners, Tunisia sat like a stepping stone on the edge of NATO's world. Long before the Cold War, the coasts of North Africa had been threaded with clandestine routes. During World War II, British special operations and exiled Polish forces used small sailing vessels, felucas, and fishing boats to move agents, downed pilots, and escapees between North Africa, southern France, and Gibraltar. They took advantage of coves, isolated beaches, and fishing communities that knew the sea better than any navy. They ran missions under darkness, hugging the shoreline to avoid radar, blending in among legitimate traffic. Those habits did not disappear when the war ended. In the decades that followed, the central Mediterranean grew into one of the world's busiest corridors for irregular movement. Today, we know it for overloaded boats departing Libya and Tunisia, packed with migrants and refugees trying to reach Italy or Malta. Reports by European and international organizations map out a dense web of smuggling routes through North Africa, from Niger and Sudan to Libya, from Egypt and Tunisia to Sicily, operated by local networks of smugglers known as Muharib and Samsar in Arabic. Those modern flows involve mostly Africans and Middle Easterners fleeing war, poverty, or dictatorship. They are not the same as the Cold War stories we are telling, but they show something important. The geography has always been there. The same short sea crossing from Tunisia to Italy, the same patchwork of ports, beaches, and islands, the same mixture of local fishermen, smugglers, and corrupt officials who, for a price, can make borders porous. Now, imagine you are a Soviet naval technician assigned to a repair ship in Alexandria in the late 1960s. You have spent months away from home. You have seen Egyptian colleagues complain quietly about their government, but speak more freely about the West. You have watched sleek Western cruise liners glide into port, their decks lined with civilians, not uniformed men, their hulls filled with consumer goods and tourist luggage. You know things you aren't supposed to know. You know that Soviet ships often stop at friendly ports in Libya, that Soviet advisors travel overland between bases, that some naval support vessels make occasional visits to harbors in neutral countries for repairs or fuel if arrangements can be made. You have heard, in whispers, about men who tried to escape, one who vanished from shore leave in Greece, another who was caught trying to swim to a foreign freighter in Port Said and never heard of again. You also know what waits for you if you go home and speak out about what you've seen. At best, reassignment to some frozen backwater, at worst, a cell and a file stamped treason. Somewhere between those realities, a thought forms. There might be a way out that runs not through Berlin or Vienna, but through smaller, less watched ports along the southern shore of the sea. This is where our Tunis escape route lives, not in a declassified operations manual, but in the realm of possibilities that men like this weighed in their heads. A route that might begin under the concrete cranes of Alexandria, cross the invisible territorial lines of Libya and Tunisia, and end on the deck of a NATO vessel or at the gate of an Italian harbor. In some versions of the story, it starts with a reassignment. You are sent from Egypt to Libya as part of a Soviet team supporting a Libyan naval facility. A CIA study notes that by the late 1970s, about 1,500 Soviet economic and military advisors were stationed in Libya, and that Soviet ships had been granted access to Libyan ports. You travel along that corridor, through ports where Soviet presence is strong and local politics are volatile. At every stop, you look at the coastline and wonder where the Soviet chain of control is weakest. One day, your ship is sent westward for routine repairs that can't be handled locally. Maybe it is bound for a friendly yard in Yugoslavia. Maybe there has been talk of a technical visit to a neutral port in the central Mediterranean. You know from rumors and from the way superiors talk when they think no one is listening, that Soviet captains sometimes bargain quietly with smaller countries for port access in emergencies. You also know that Tunisia, though not a Soviet ally, has ports large enough to handle foreign ships and close enough to be useful in a pinch. Since World War II, harbors like Tunis and Bizerte have seen warships and merchantmen from half the world. The country maintains relations with both East and West, trying to balance them in a way that serves its own interests. Now, imagine your ship never gets there. Perhaps the Tunis escape route exists only as a whispered contingency among a handful of crew members who have grown tired of living double lives. But the logic is there. A Soviet vessel putting into a neutral or non-aligned harbor for repairs or resupply would create a moment, a window of hours or days, when a determined defector could try to vanish. How would it work? Here we move from documented practice to plausible reconstruction. Soviet security doctrine for ships abroad was strict. Crews were often kept aboard, shore leave limited to trusted officers, and patrols organized to prevent unauthorized contact with foreigners. Yet even in the tightest systems, things go wrong. A night shift does not show up, a watch loses sight of a man for a few minutes, the noise of cargo operations covers the sound of a body slipping over the side. We have real-world analogs. In the Kudirka case, a Soviet sailor swam across rough water from his own ship to a U.S. Coast Guard cutter desperately clinging to American metal instead of Soviet steel. In various Black Sea ports, Soviet citizens attempted to board foreign freighters or sneak into Western consulates, sometimes successfully, often not. There are accounts of Eastern Bloc citizens hiding in cargo holds, lifeboats, and ventilation ducts to cross borders unseen. Transplant those methods to a Tunisian harbor, and you have the outline of a Tunisian escape route. A Soviet sailor sliding into dark water and making for a foreign ship, a Soviet advisor slipping out of a hotel and heading for a Western embassy, a technician bribing a local smuggler to hide him in a truck bound for a quieter stretch of coast. From that quieter stretch, the second leg begins. You are no longer under Soviet colors, but you are not safe. Tunisia, like other North African states, has its own interests to balance: relations with Moscow, relations with Washington, relations with its Arab neighbors. It may not want the diplomatic headache of a high-profile defector. So you look not to the land, but to the sea. And there, again, the geography offers options. The central Mediterranean narrows between the North African coast and Sicily. Fishing boats and small craft have been making that crossing for generations. In modern times, we have seen tens of thousands of migrants and refugees board overloaded vessels in Tunisia and Libya, bound for Lampedusa, Malta, or the Italian mainland, a grim testimony to how permeable that stretch of water can be when someone is willing to risk everything. In the 1960s or 1970s, the boats would have been smaller, the traffic less intense, but the basic idea was the same. For the right price, a fisherman or smuggler might be persuaded to take a single extra passenger aboard under cover of darkness and head north. The journey could take a day, 2 days, depending on the boat and the conditions. It was dangerous, but no more dangerous than crossing minefields in Central Europe had been for other defectors. On the horizon, lights begin to appear. The navigation buoys around Sicily, the glow of Italian towns, and sometimes the imposing gray silhouettes of NATO warships. Here, the Cold War comes fully into view. On one side, a man who has crawled out from under the heaviest surveillance system on Earth, soaked, exhausted, unable to go back. On the other, steel giants packed with computers, radar arrays, satellite communications, symbols of a technological ecosystem that Moscow both envied and feared. For Soviet planners, the Mediterranean had long been a place where the technological imbalance with the United States was painfully obvious. A U.S. Navy analysis from the 1970s describes how the Sixth Fleet's integrated radar, aircraft, and surface forces gave NATO overwhelming situational awareness at sea, to the point where some Western officers casually referred to the Mediterranean as a NATO lake. Soviet ships, supported from Egyptian and later Syrian and Libyan ports, could project power, but they struggled to match the sophistication of American command and control systems and anti-submarine warfare. Now imagine seeing that up close, not as a Soviet admiral reading intelligence reports, but as a defector hauled out of the water by an American or Italian crew. You are wrapped in a blanket, shivering on a steel deck that vibrates with the hum of gas turbines and the faint thrum of machinery behind closed hatches. Around you, sailors speak a language you learned only from forbidden radio broadcasts and smuggled tapes. Above you, antennas and rados bristle against the sky. You notice little things: the brightness of the lights in the passageways, the number of computer terminals and screens in a single control room, the way information flows between departments without someone barking orders. You are taken to a cabin for questioning, and there is a fax machine on the table that can copy and send documents in seconds, technology that, back home, was tightly controlled because of how easily it could spread ideas. Later, if you are granted asylum and make it to shore, the contrast deepens. In Rome or Athens or Marseille, you see consumer electronics shops displaying televisions, cassette players, and later video recorders made in Japan and Western Europe. In airports, you watch business travelers tapping away at portable computers. In offices, photocopiers hum, churning out documents that no censor reads before they are filed or thrown away. For someone who grew up in a system where every typewriter had to be registered with the police, where photocopying machines were locked behind bureaucratic doors, where owning the wrong book could bring the secret police to your apartment, this is more than just convenience. It's a revelation. It is the lived daily proof of something Western broadcasts had always claimed, that the capitalist world was not collapsing into chaos, but racing ahead in technology, information, and quality of life. Soviet leaders understood, at least in part, how dangerous that revelation could be. That is why they tried so hard to control not just their borders, but their citizens' perceptions. They jammed foreign radio, they censored imported films, they kept sailors on tight leashes in port. They punished defectors harshly, not only to eliminate security risks, but to send a message: no one escapes us without paying a terrible price. And yet, people kept trying. They tried along the Berlin Wall, they tried at the Austro-Hungarian frontier, they tried in Black Sea harbors and in foreign airports, and in a few little-known cases, unrecorded by Western journalists, buried in classified files, or preserved only in the memories of those who made it, they tried along the edges of North Africa, in places like Tunisia, where Soviet influence thinned and the sea opened up toward the west. That is the space where the Tunisian escape route lives as a Cold War story. It is not the main highway of defections, it's a side path, a back door, an improvised corridor formed at the intersection of three realities: the Soviet drive to project power into the Mediterranean, the long smoldering networks of smuggling and clandestine movement in North Africa, and the pull of a Western world that held out not only political freedom, but a level of technological modernity that the Soviet system, for all its rockets and parades, could never quite replicate. For American viewers, that contrast is the heart of the story. On one side, a superpower that could send advisors to Libya and ships to Port Said, but that had to watch its own men like potential escapees. On the other, a coalition of democracies whose biggest problem was not keeping their citizens in, but deciding how many outsiders to let in. On one side, a state that feared photocopiers and paperback novels. On the other, a civilization that flooded the world with information and manufactured devices designed to copy, transmit, and amplify it. In the end, the Iron Curtain did not fall because someone found a single secret passage through Tunisia or any other place. It fell because, over decades, millions of people on its eastern side saw enough of the alternative to decide, consciously or unconsciously, that they wanted something different. The escapes, whether through Berlin, across the Austro-Hungarian frontier, or by way of a small boat leaving a quiet North African cove, were the sharpest, most dramatic expressions of that choice. The Tunisian escape route as a narrative lets us follow that choice into a part of the map we don't usually associate with the Cold War. It reminds us that even where the confrontation was supposedly between superpowers and their proxies, there were always individuals in the middle, looking at the ships in their harbors, the radios in their hands, the lights on the other side of the sea, and quietly asking themselves a dangerous question: which world do I really want to live in? For a few of them, the answer led through the Strait of Sicily, past the coast of Tunisia, into the embrace of Western technology and Western freedom. For the rest of us, their journeys are a way to see the Cold War not just as a contest of missiles and ideology, but as a series of human crossings, each one a small, risky, deeply personal vote in favor of a future where borders mattered less than ideas, and where the most powerful weapon was not a bomb or a tank, but the ability to see, to speak, and to choose.